Good evening. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Elisa Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 8th Annual David R. Kessler Lecture in Lesbian and Gay Studies. This lecture, made possible by the generosity of David R. Kessler, is a highlight of the CLAG's year, as it honors a scholar who has made a lifetime contribution to the field of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer studies. Past honorees have included Joan Nessel, Edmund White, Barbara Smith, Monique Vatique, Esther Newton, Samuel Delaney, and Eve Sedgwick, several of whom I'm happy to say are in the house with us tonight. Welcome. Tonight we're thrilled to be honoring the activist scholar John D'Amelio. I can't wait to hear his talk, Wrestling with Rustin, or The Left Will Rise Again, maybe. I'm sure everyone is eager to hear John's talk, so I promise that we will move to it quickly. I'd just like to take a quick moment to express some thanks and to invite you to other CLAGS events that are coming up this year. First, thanks to all of you for coming and for supporting CLAGS. As you know, we are a membership organization, and we rely on your support for the many conferences, colloquia, and other events that we produce. In the interest of time, we have decided to spare you the formal pitch tonight. So I'd like to urge you instead to read the pitch that is in your program and to, in fact, respond to it. And please sign our mailing list later as well, if you aren't on it already, during this reception that will follow tonight's lecture in the back of this auditorium. And you'll be able to pick up calendars of our events there that look like this. Don't go home without one. And for a fuller description of our spring lineup and for other kinds of information and links to all kinds of groovy places, you can check our website, www.clags.org. And there are continuing updates of our calendar there, as we are often adding new programs long after we have met the fall printer's deadline for this calendar. Let me just highlight a couple of our spring offerings. Our popular Seminars in the City series will continue, I think, in our 6th semester of offering these public programs, if I'm not mistaken. It will continue in February, and this semester will focus on Latino-Latina LGBTQ literature, and it will be taught by CLAG's board members Licia Filmata and Jose Munoz. Our monthly colloquium series resumes in February, curated by our board member Paisley Curra. And I'd like to invite all of you to what is sure to be a groundbreaking conference on April 13th and 14th called Whose Millennium? Religion, Sexuality, and the Values of Citizenship. All of our programs are produced by the labor of our own dedicated board of directors and by our small but magical staff. Time doesn't permit me to name all of them, so please read their names that are listed in your program. And more important, please chat with us during the reception. You'll be able to recognize board members by their glinting name tags. But right now, I'd just like to ask the board and the staff to stand up for a moment so you'll be able to identify them later. And I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking them for all of their energy, ideas, and nitty-gritty work. And I'll see all of you board members tomorrow morning, bright and early, for our December board meeting, of course. I'd also like to acknowledge the founder and the first director of CLAGS, who's here tonight, whose vision, commitment, and hard labor brought this organization into being as a strong, vibrant community of scholars, activists, artists, and folks of all kinds who share the conviction that knowledge can change consciousness and thus politics, society, and lives. Marty Duberman. Indeed, this audience is filled with those scholars, activists, artists, and so on. And while time doesn't permit me to acknowledge all the luminaries among us, all the prize winners and community leaders and political organizers and folks who have contributed so much to the struggle for LGBTQ liberation and for social justice in general, I would like simply to acknowledge the history and the force gathered in this room right now. Looking out from here makes me feel incredibly hopeful about the future. Speaking of looking out over this lovely room, I ought to mention why we are here. in a mundane sense, I mean, here at Columbia University instead of at the CUNY Graduate Center. The Grad Center moved over the summer, and our new auditorium is not quite ready yet, so we're grateful to be welcomed here uptown. I do invite you, though, to visit our new quarters on 35th Street and 5th Avenue for our spring events, of course, but also just to drop by our offices for a chat anytime you're in the neighborhood. The Graduate Center is the building that was once Altman's department store, and I like to think that the Claggs office occupies what used to be the Notions department. Clearly, it's time for me to give the podium over to tonight's featured speakers. So here's our format. 3 people, distinguished authors and community activists in their own rights, will honor John D'Amelio with brief testimonials about his varied contributions by way of introducing him. So let me briefly introduce our 3 introducers. First will be Lisa Dugan, not only an indefatigable member of our board of directors and the organizer of last year's major Claggs conference, Local Politics, Global Change, Academics and Activists Thinking About a Queer Future. Lisa is also professor of American Studies at New York University and the author with Nan Hunter of Sex Wars, Sexual Dissent, and Political Culture. After Lisa, we'll hear from Alan Barabay, a long-standing independent scholar, best known perhaps for his pioneering book, Coming Out Under Fire, about the experiences of gay men and lesbians in the US military during the Second World War. He's working now on a history of the Cooks and Stewards Union of the 1930s to 50s, tentatively titled A Third Black, A Third Red, A Third Queer. And finally, our last introducer is Urvashi Vad, well known to anyone who has paid even the slightest attention to the movement for the last decade or so. The author of the influential book, Virtual Equality, The Mainstreaming of Gay and Lesbian Liberation, Urvashi is the director of the Policy Institute of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Thanks, all of you, for participating tonight. And to the rest of you, thank you all for coming. I look forward to speaking with you during the reception.
Evening. I left my home state of Virginia to come to New York City when I graduated from college in 1976. Soon after my arrival, Jonathan Ned Katz invited me to a study group on the history of sexuality, where I met Carol Vance, Joan Nessel, and John D'Amelio, among others. For me then, it was a lot like meeting rock stars and movie queens. These were the people who had the kind of life I had most dreamed of in Virginia. John, for instance, was in the midst of writing the first gay history dissertation in the nation, while living in a large Upper West Side apartment with other gay men who hosted Saturday night salons bulging with friends, activist comrades, lovers, writers, artists, intellectuals, and fellow travelers. Plus, he was charming, cute, and graced with one of the most distinctively vibrant laughs I have ever heard. I found it all impossibly romantic and fabulous. John was exactly the kind of person I wanted to be, with the kind of life I most hoped for. Then a really strange thing happened. John finished that dissertation. That's not the strange part. Which became his first book, Sexual Politics, Sexual Communities, a pioneering field-founding book on the homophile movement in the US, and went on the academic job market. Though there was just no contesting that he was conventionally qualified up the wazoo, with a Danforth Fellowship and an Ivy League PhD, and he had written a groundbreaking dissertation, it's kind of an understatement to say that John was not exactly courted and pursued by history departments, as he clearly should have been and would have been, if not for the pervasive homophobia at the time. Now, I would like to say that that situation has changed. But my own, although I'm in American Studies at NYU, my tenure line is in the history department, and I want you to know that this is not speaking bitterness. Exactly. But History departments are still notoriously and routinely hostile to work in lesbian and gay history. There's no such thing as a job in lesbian or gay history, or even in the history of sexuality. There's a very uneven acceptance of queer projects across the disciplines, which I think some folks who are located in some of the more welcoming disciplines don't really quite realize. In 1983, the hostility was fairly uniform, but after applying far and wide, John did finally get one interview and was hired by the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Not accidentally, a formerly all-women's institution, where he was warmly welcomed and immediately adored, as nature intended that he should be, by colleagues and students. Okay, now we get to the strange part, okay? The strangeness for me was that after living my entire life in the South, I had run off to the queer dreamscape of New York City. Having been told by my parents that it was Sodom and Gomorrah, I left as soon as I could afford to. And here was John, who grew up in New York and was now departing for North Carolina. I thought it was such a twisted turn of fate. And soon after he moved, I remember talking to him on the phone. He was talking excitedly about having a lawn. It gets better. A garden and chickens in his backyard. You remember that, John? The chickens. Chickens in his backyard. I told him I thought the charm of chickens would wear off pretty fast. And I was wrong. It was 13 years before the charm wore off completely. A time period during which John wrote 2 more books. The first, Narrative History of Sexuality in the United States, Intimate Matters, co-authored with Estelle Friedman, and his collection of essays, Making Trouble. After a lifetime of activist organizing and writing, which always accompanied his academic projects, John decided to turn his attention full-time to activism for a while. He became the founding director of the NGLTF Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., which I'm sure Urvashi, as the current director, will have something to say about. After a couple of years, he then moved on to work full-time on his newest project, a biography of civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, which he'll talk to you about tonight. John has now returned to academia. He's begun a new job this year at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where he'll be designing a lesbian and gay studies curriculum, and I hope also training the next generation of queer historians. But those years between academic jobs, years he spent organizing and writing, were incredibly fruitful ones, both personally and professionally. He addressed himself to a wide variety of tasks and audiences. He thought about the future of queer politics and the left. He got a really cool haircut. It was blonde for a while, not that it gave me any ideas. And grew a goatee. He started running marathons, and he had a lot of fun. Again, for the second time in my life, John showed me by example the kind of person I want to be and the kind of life I want. Academic institutions and academic careers can provide us with opportunities and resources, but they can also suck us in, drain us, and divert us. Getting out for a while, something everyone inside will tell you, is a terrible risk, a stupid move, or a possible career killer. I've been given that advice a number of times where I said, I think I'm going to quit. Getting out for a while can be perspective restoring, politically reinvigorating, and just gosh darn fun. It can also do a lot for your wardrobe and your health. Getting out for a while can be an opportunity to decide whether or why you want to go back and strategize more clearly about how to use academic institutions rather than get used up by them. As I said, I'm not bitter. And so I'm here tonight to thank John D'Amelio for reminding me, with the example of his life, how important it is to keep our eyes on the prize of polymorphous political engagements. Engagements that keep us focused on the big picture of political and social transformations and in communication with an expanding rather than a narrowing range of publics. I thank him more specifically and personally for reminding me that I don't have to be a professor if I don't want to, even if they do offer me tenure. And I thank him for his work as activist, teacher, and writer in building the progressive queer social movement that I have called home since I first met him. Thank you, John.
It was 20 years ago, in the spring of 1979. John D'Amelio came to San Francisco from Manhattan to do research for his dissertation on the homophile movement in the United States before Stonewall. He decided to attend a meeting at the San Francisco Lesbian and Gay History Project, which was then just forming. We were a grassroots group of activists and scholars, including Amber Hollabaugh. Is Amber here? Yes, and Jeffrey Escoffier is also here, both current or former board members here at CLAGS. We were dedicated to uncovering and making public the hidden history of lesbians and gay men. But John didn't just visit our history project. He jumped right in and volunteered to facilitate our meetings. He was good, too. I was floored when I first saw how John worked. Here was this intelligent, articulate scholar who had already figured out how to research lesbian and gay history and was telling us what he'd learned. He was a dedicated gay liberationist whose collective household in Manhattan, as Lisa said, held Saturday night gay socialist potluck dinners a few blocks from here on West 111th Street. Who here ever went to any of those potlucks? That's a lot of hands. See, John? He was a persuasive speaker and writer who had adapted skills he learned on Catholic high school debating teams to advocate gay liberation, socialism, feminism, and racial equality. I'll bet that tonight John will make 3 main points and he will state them very clearly. 1, 2, 3. Sorry. He was a powerful yet modest leader who had developed his leadership skills through a long, painful struggle against the cruel lie that working-class queer boys are dumb, worthless, and silly. John is smart, he's a national treasure, and he moves through the world with a quiet dignity. He is also cute and sexy, as has been remarked, and I was thrilled to learn at the time available. We courted, fell in love, and became long-distance lovers for a couple of years. Since then, we've remained friends for life. Back in the days before email, long-distance lovers, especially those of us who couldn't afford phone calls, wrote lots of letters. Those of us who were budding historians saved all the letters. Tonight I'm going to break a historian's rule. I'm going to read without permission a few passages from John's first letters to me. Forgive me, John. His letters to me capture a little of what it was like before lesbian and gay social history had entered the academy, before you could have a career doing it, or even get a grant. We were activist scholars then, and our work grew out of and relied on the support networks of a political movement. John wanted to know how that movement had come about, then tell other activists about it so we could use that history to inform our political work. John's first articles on gay history were published not in academic journals, but in lesbian and gay movement newspapers, The Body Politic in Toronto, The Gay Community News in Boston. Today, there are no gay movement periodicals left that will publish the kind of substantial yet accessible history articles that John wrote back then. John's dissertation was a pioneering attempt to do lesbian and gay social movement history, not only within the academy, but inside a history department. When at first he decided to do his dissertation on the history of homosexuality, his advisor told him that he couldn't because the topic was too narrow and there weren't enough sources. That's how much things have changed. 20 years ago, a grassroots lesbian and gay history and archives movement was beginning to take shape in the United States, from San Francisco and Los Angeles to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and other places. The support from that movement, which John helped to create, is what made it possible for him to do his work. After returning to New York that summer of '79, John wrote about this in his first letter to me. I've been trying hard to let myself tell all, why my months in SF were so terrific, how all the parts of my life seemed to come together so perfectly. Because I spent most of my time with gay leftist historians where there was a very high level of shared experience, assumptions, and understanding. But those early years were no golden age. Activist historians spent most of our time trying to make ends meet. I was in San Francisco selling popcorn and tickets in a movie theater. John was here in New York writing entries for facts on file and working in offices as a temporary typist. Your statement about having to work full-time for a while, he wrote me in the summer of 1980, and the difficulties of oppressed people in doing what we need to hit the spot. I have been in such a state overworking, even part-time. My own work ground to a halt, and because I'm only working half-time, I'm not even saving money, just earning enough to live on, yet having no time to do my own writing. It was making me really despair and question the worth of what I'm doing, even of my whole life. This past week, I put my foot down and I went to work at 1 every day. I got so much done, finished my chapter at last, and I'm now typing it. But after concentration and creativity in the morning, and 4 to 5 hours of straight typing at my job in the afternoon, I am a zombie by evening. And then in his letter, he inserted what he called a Marxist interlude. Which goes, IBM self-correcting selectrics may be a wonder of modern technology, but they also increase the exploitation of workers. More surplus value gets extracted from us. I swear, I'm typing 100 words a minute on it, and because it's self-correcting, the frustration of making errors is cut down, which allows me to type longer without taking a break. Sometimes I worry, he went on, that I'm becoming one of those self-centered, self-realized, me-first dodos. He was anticipating the 80s here. But I don't give a shit. I want to write. I'm worried about how I will survive other than by having my life energy drained through alienated labor that means little to me. If I get my degree this year, as I expect to, this will be the last chance to get on a, quote, career track that will allow me to continue research and writing. I've held out long, but it seems like the jig is up. Help. It's depressing. Then I think about how all of us are struggling along, trying to create a gay history, a gay cultural presence, a new liberatory understanding of human sexuality, eking out a living, getting by on less than nothing. I am tired of marginality. This is where my head is at these days, working all day, frustrated and angry the rest of the time. I remember one particular afternoon when John made one of his rare visits to San Francisco. He'd finally finished the dissertation and had begun to work on the book based on it, Sexual Politics, Sexual Communities, to be published by the University of Chicago Press, which was then developing an interest in gay history. During that visit, John and I hesitantly identified a difficult problem in our work, the problem of overlapping subject areas. My research was turning toward World War II, and so was parts of John's book. He had a PhD in a book contract. I had neither. Our unequal positions in the publishing and academic worlds were potential sources of conflict between us that seemed to threaten even our relationship. This wasn't easy. We were both scared shitless. We went for a walk in Golden Gate Park, found a bench, and sat there talking for hours, trying to sort things out, trying to find ways to turn potentially harmful competition into cooperation. We named the kind of institutional power we each did or did not have access to, described the documents we did and didn't want the other to use, and tried to explain why and asked if that was okay, talked through our disagreements, and in the end came up with a working understanding. We also decided to put the documents we'd each uncovered into grassroots archives for others to use when we were done. What we were trying to accomplish that afternoon in the park was to make our individual work remain an integral part of a larger movement, to apply our radical vision of collectivity to the way we actually did our writing. I remember that conversation so vividly, I think, because John showed me then how something I wanted was really possible to have. Scholars could actually help each other keep from veering off into the competitive me-first directions where this capitalist system lures us with rewards every minute of every working day. Last month, John brought me out to speak at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he's just been hired. Part of his new job there is to put together a lesbian and gay studies curriculum. As John showed me around his new campus, we talked about how incredible it is that this university for blue-collar students hired him not despite, but because he writes and teaches lesbian and gay history. It seemed as if a working-class queer boy had found a good home, at least one that appreciated what he did. That day, I also realized something else, that John's gay history work builds on a long tradition of activist scholarship that is committed to social equality and justice. That commitment is what led John and other activists in the late 70s to create a movement of grassroots lesbian and gay history projects and archives. It's what led earlier generations to establish working-class institutions of higher learning, like the University of Illinois at Chicago and CUNY here in New York. And it's what leads CLAGS to fund the research of activists and independent scholars like myself, as well as the work of graduate students whose work is as innovative today as John's unfunded work was 20 years ago. John D'Amelio's work grew out of the same commitment to social equality and carries its tradition along in the form of lesbian and gay history. It is the power of that commitment, I believe, that helped him not stop writing when economic despair forced him to question its very worth. Today, economic despair once again threatens the morale of young queer scholars. John's groundbreaking body of work reminds us that it has always been an economic struggle, but one that's worth the young scholars' perseverance and our collective support to do the hard work of creating, as young John put it 20 years ago, a gay history, a gay cultural presence, and a new liberatory understanding of human sexuality. Thank you, John, for keep doing that work.
And to give an introduction to him, who needs no introduction after those last two. And I'm tempted to follow the advice of my girlfriend, who always counsels extreme brevity and humor, and simply follow up the introductions you've heard by saying, and now, here's Johnny. But instead, I'll follow my own more ponderous instincts and talk for a few minutes about this extraordinary gay man who deserves all the praise and notice he's getting tonight, and lots more. John D'Amelio has been a mentor, a partner in movement work, and a constant in my political life for more than 13 years. All of us in this room have been informed and shaped by his intellect and his work, and each of us who knows him has relied on and benefited from his incredible balance, his good and wise counsel, his ready giggle, his consistent kindness, his staggering humility, and his incredible patience. How can I do justice to the hundreds and hundreds of hours that John and I have spent scheming, dreaming, cajoling, inventing, to the dozens of projects we've started together, to the institutions that we've helped form and build, to the interventions that we've attempted? How can I, in 10 minutes or less, acknowledge and thank John enough for the generosity he has shown me as a comrade, a teacher, a guide, and a loving friend? The other presenters have spoken powerfully of John's contribution to the field of history, to his brilliance and his originality, and to his stature as one of the giants of American intellectual life. What I want to speak briefly about is about his impact on the national gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered movement. Because make no mistake about it, John D'Amelio has been an architect of the progressive GLBT movement at the national level. His involvement has been central to the shape, coherence, and functionality, to the extent that we have any of those, of this progressive GLBT movement. To the extent that anything exists, it's because of him. A social change movement's existence is neither magical nor preordained. It's not the byproduct of some random, mystical, witchy chemistry that creates it, nor is a movement's existence, Hegel notwithstanding, the outcome of anything inevitable in history. Movements arise out of need, and they decline in value and importance when they fail to meet the needs of the people they set out to serve or fail to adapt to the changing realities of those people. This is an insight that I think John understands really well, and it enables him to be an extremely practical and effective movement leader. John has always championed the necessity of a progressive movement, but he has also argued that progressivism needs to be defined in relationship to people's real-life needs, not in relationship to abstract theory or rhetoric. The GLBT movement arose out of our need to free ourselves from repression, and our movement's continuing relevance arises from the persistence of the many forms of prejudice and stigma we continue to experience and to transform. Yet the needs that formed our movement over 50 years ago have changed as the conditions of our lives have changed, as the movement has changed the material conditions around us. John has pointed out to me many times that millions more people being out and queer means that there is more diversity in our communities, and therefore more ideological diversity as well. He never uses that fact to argue that progressives should support a more conservative movement, merely to explain why the left wing remains less influential today than it was several years ago, and to argue for a politics that takes ideological diversity into account. The emergence of many kinds of GLBT publics, the existence of GLBT political and cultural movements in all parts of this country and throughout the world, means that our original objectives of visibility, access, and individual freedom have begun to be won. I think it also means that these goals are no longer enough for a progressive GLBT movement to pursue, and that they need to be supplemented. Today, we need a movement that can offer insight and policy options in the major debates at play in our country, a movement that's able to intervene in efforts to achieve health care for all people, a movement that can defend and reform public schools, that can redefine family policy, that can open up aging and social security policy to the reality of GLBT seniors' lives, that can contribute meaningfully to ending racism and remedying racial prejudice, that can intervene in welfare and in housing and poverty policy debates. Today's movement, in short, needs to be focused as much on defining the kind of society openly gay and lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people will live in as it is in defending our right to live out and in the open. John understands this need for specificity, for a movement capable of intervening in policy debates, for a movement that has the ability to think about how to create a more equitable public policy. And you know what? He didn't just understand that, he did something about it. That's why in 1995, he left his nice tenured job to found and run the Policy Institute of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, the only non-academic-based think tank that exists right now. It's dedicated to progressive policy analysis and strategy development. That's the Policy Institute that I run, and it's now located here in New York. Wouldn't exist without John's vision. The existence of a progressive wing of the GLBT movement is even to this day something that all of us in this room would not agree about. It's not something that is settled, nor is it something that can be assumed. Progressive politics in America remain oppositional and transformative politics. And capitalism does not like opposition, and it resists any transformation that has something other than profit as its goal. This is, after all, the dot-com era, and being anything close to a dot-communist is as marginalizing and dangerous today as it was in each previous decade. The lack of a shared political and economic analysis to ground the work of a progressive GLBT movement is a problem we share with many other social justice movements. The civil rights movements of our times have been primarily directed towards the goals of achieving equality. Such goals are distinct from the goals of movements for economic and broader political justice. Indeed, one can draw a distinction between movements for civil rights with their focus on equality and movements for human rights, which have as their focus justice and equity, including economic justice. As an equality-based movement launched by a people who are still very far away from achieving the dream of full civil equality, the GLBT movement has not really developed a full discussion of its economic agenda, of its commitment to economic justice, of its real commitment to racial justice, or even these days, of its commitment to feminist values. In core ways, the struggle to create a progressive GLBT movement reflects the tension between a politics built up around identity and a politics built around ideology, or a politics built perhaps around a broad set of shared desired outcomes, values, or goals. John, I think, has long believed that it's possible to be grounded both in identity and ideologies, and on most days I agree with him. He's never taken the existence of progressive queer politics for granted and has actively tried to define what this might mean. Again, the work I know best is the work I've seen John do over the past 13 years within and around and through NGLTF. When he started working at NGLTF on its board of directors, the task force was not an organization that self-identified as progressive. Its mission was narrow, its reach even narrower. John's advocacy on that board let that body commit fully to social justice values. They changed the mission statement to reflect a commitment to ending racism and ending sexism, as well as homophobia. They broadened the mission of this organization, and that work was critical to the organization as it exists today. His long service at the leadership level at NGLTF left that organization more invested also in grassroots movement building rather than just organization building. In fact, it's terrible at organization building, but pretty good at building a progressive grassroots movement in each and every state, which is its priority, largely as a result of John's leadership. It made NGLTF one of the only mainstream queer groups that was willing, imperfectly, sporadically, but definitely, to articulate a multi-issue, anti-racist, pro-woman, pro-queer politics. Under John's guidance, and often using his drafts as the text, NGLTF took positions on welfare reform, immigration reform, racial justice remedies like affirmative action. When John drafted the NGLTF's board's position against the Gulf War in 1991, it was a brilliant synthesis of arguments that coherently made the case why a queer organization would oppose that war. The arguments were intelligent, moral, grounded in fact, accessible, and sensible, all hallmarks of a D'Amelio essay. Whenever John speaks at funders' conferences or at public events, at movement gatherings or at small meetings of activists, he makes the case and has made the case for a multi-issue movement, while always grounding his arguments and his examples in his life as a working-class, Catholic, white, gay man. That combination of vision and honesty, practicality and risk characterizes John's work in the movement, and it's amazing to witness. Now, the John that I know best, and there's a great phrase, is a John who works really hard. Is a John who works really hard and worries secretly that he's really not doing enough. He's a tireless and careful organizer who deliberates before he acts. He's a guy who will meet you for a phone date, or if you're in the same town, for a date at any hour of day or night to help you figure out a problem. He's someone who's always prepared and ready for what he says he'll do, someone who runs an incredibly smooth meeting, and someone who loves a good piece of movement dish. He's always fishing for it, in fact. The John D'Amelio I know creates theory from practice and tests his theories with experiments. He is such a modest man who seeds ideas without taking credit. He's so disciplined, he ran a marathon twice already and has produced more concrete work than most people I know do in a lifetime. He's someone who loves to hang out, to eat, to laugh. He used to love to smoke. And I imagine outside the boring situations in which we often meet, he's someone who kicks ass on the dance floor. He gets indignant and often incredulous at the latest thing he's read somewhere. He makes me laugh at its folly, while somehow managing to maintain a respectful tone towards the labor of the person who created the very argument that he's attacking. I want to conclude my personal testimonial to John with one final observation about another kind of role he's played in the movement that I don't think gets noticed, that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And it's one of John's most important contributions in activism. The way he has prioritized and helped forge better relationships among GLBT leaders. Changing the world at its core is a process that depends on relationships, whether that relationship is having a healthy sense of self or a relationship to others in the movement, to chosen and original family, to community, or to the nation. In political science language, perhaps this concept I'm calling relationship would be called citizenship, but I like the term relationship better. I know that I've survived for this long as an activist for one primary reason, the relationships and friendships that I've formed with colleagues like John. John recognized this insight and acted on it. In the late 1980s, with the late and great New York activist Ken Dawson and the wonderful Tim Sweeney, John pioneered the model of leadership retreats among people working in the GLBT movement, which still continues to this day and has helped foster a tremendous amount of goodwill and relationship among GLBT leaders. He's worked closely with me over the last 3 years to create another model, the National Policy Roundtable, that brings together the heads of all the national GLBT policy-oriented organizations in the country. And we make them meet together twice a year, 2 days at a time. And that's the only time these groups get together to share information, get briefed by each other on issues of common concern, and develop the relationships that knit a strong movement together. John, as I was tallying up the statistics that make up my activist life, I realized that you've seen me through several dozen lovers, 2 major girlfriends, the writing of one book, and the editing of another one that we're doing together that's coming out next year, 4 job changes, the collapse of major friendships, hundreds of ups and downs, being called a Stalinist, a Quisling, an anarchist, a coward, an idealist, and being called hurtful racist epithets. I realized that we've seen each other through your wonderful relationship with Jim, Greensboro, DC, now Chicago, through 24 NGLTF board meetings, 36 NGLTF executive committee meetings, 6 NGLTF executive directors, 6 national policy roundtables, 11 creating change conferences, several marches on Washington, hundreds of planning meetings, the death from AIDS of at least 180 friends and comrades we worked with during our tenure in the national movement over the past 13 years that I could count, the births of more of our queer friends' children than we ever thought we would see. I love our shared history and look forward to the ways that we will add to it. And I love you so very much. And since this is a Claggs lecture, I feel like I should close with a quote from some obscure but yet important theorist. So I will not disappoint, as Felix, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong too, as Felix Guattari said, we should speak about the intellectual function and not about intellectuals. I think this function is what John's work and activism have defined. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here's Johnny.
This is great, really. It's better than the Oscars. No, think about it. First, you get your friends to say nice things about you for a long time. Then you don't have 4 other friends who are feeling really bad because you're up here and they're not. And then you don't have to leave after 35 seconds. You're actually going to sit here and listen to me for a long time. This is really, really very good. I also have to say, Alan, this may actually be the first talk I ever give that doesn't have 3 points. I'm serious. I mean, it's just like, it's different. I want to start with some thanks of my own so I can calm down. I want to thank Alan, Lisa, and Irv, not only for saying nice things about me, but really for friendships that have lasted a very long time and that have meant at least as much to me as you were suggesting has meant to you, and that's really special. I want to thank Bert Hansen, who's sitting back there, because he is the person who turned my attention in the direction of Bayard Rustin. I want to thank Elisa and Jill Dolan, who is not here tonight, and the Board of CLAGS for giving me this honor and this opportunity. David Kessler for generously endowing this lecture. Marty Duberman, not only for having the vision and the perseverance to create something like CLAGS, but especially as it worked itself out for the decision to have it at CUNY, because CLAGS would be a very different and probably far less attractive animal if it had ended up at Yale. Finally, I want to thank my partner, Jim Olson. We celebrated our 19th anniversary this week on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. That's the day we met. And I have to say that he and I are the only ones who know how happy it is making him that the months of living with my obsession about this lecture are just about over. I also want to start, one more thing before I actually get into the talk. This is my truth in advertising disclaimer. There are real perils in coming up with a title for a lecture long before you've actually written the lecture. So I can promise you that we will be wrestling with Rustin tonight, but I think the left is not going to rise again tonight, so, which probably actually is not a surprise in 1999. All right. 4 years ago, CLAGS sponsored a conference on the state of gay and lesbian history. I was one of several presenters in a session on biography. None of us on the panel had consulted beforehand, but by the beginning of the third or fourth presentation, a common pattern had emerged and the audience erupted with laughter. Each one of us had opened our remarks with a mixture of apology and denial. We each were not, we assured the audience, writing a biography. Now, at the time, the motives behind the denial seemed pretty obvious to me. Most of us on the panel would have defined ourselves as activist scholars. We saw the work we did as intellectual endeavors closely tied to a project of social change. In writing about Bayard Rustin, for instance, I was much less interested in recounting the life of an individual than I was in exploring a period of radical social movements. To see my purpose as the telling of one man's life story seemed unworthy of the years of effort that a biography takes. Beyond that, gay and lesbian scholarship in the 90s was increasingly falling under the sign of the queer. Its methods were those of the intellectual avant-garde, while biography was as traditional and boring a genre as one could imagine. From the obligatory opening about the grandparents of the subject to the closing at the memorial service, biographies unfold in a fashion that is too linear and too predictable for the end of the millennium. Sometime after the conference, I began to have dreams about Rustin. This invasion of my psyche gave me another angle for understanding the refusal to own up to my status as a biographer. I have cared passionately about everything that I have researched and written, but for the most part, I have been able to write history from at least something of a comfortable emotional distance. It's true that I can remember feelings of disgust as conservative gay men in the McCarthy era stole the Mattachine Society from my beloved communist founders. But this was a short-term encounter with characters and episodes that I left behind quickly as I moved on to the next chapter in the story. Not so with Rustin. We have been living together now for more than a decade. He's there when I wake up in the morning and when I go to bed at night. We have a long-term committed relationship, and I have not been able to treat his life and his experience with the kind of detachment that I brought to the study of history. In our postmodern world, where fractured selves and fluid identities somehow keep peskily asserting themselves, it's hardly original to acknowledge that biography is never just about the life whose story gets told. The experience, the concerns, the identities, the subjectivity of the author are always present, weaving their way into the structure, presentation, and content of the biography, even when invisible to the reader. Biography fails when this dual subjectivity goes unacknowledged, when we delude ourselves into believing that we can reconstruct another life uncontaminated by our own. But it can succeed, I think, amazingly well when the passions of the biographer are thoughtfully mobilized, when identity and difference, empathy and incomprehension work dynamically with and against each other to produce flashes of insight and sparks of tension on the page. Last spring, when Jill Dolan let me know that I had been selected to give this year's Kessler Lecture, it came not only as an honor, but as an opportunity. I don't want to go so far as to claim that Rustin and I had been engaged in mortal combat, but the easy part of his life, easy at least for me, was over. As I approached the period that had most drawn me to the project in the first place, I found myself stuck in a way that is unusual for me. I was trapped in a place for which writer's block is not the right description. My dreams about Rustin, which had stopped long before this, offered something of a clue as to what was going on. The setting in these dreams was always a rattly furnished, frenetically busy activist office. The emotional tone was one of urgency. The plot line was always the same. Bayard and I were both there. He was engaged with something, and I was desperately trying to get his attention. Now, my reaction to the first dream, the first time I had it, was something like, Jesus, what kind of a biography will I write if I am this obsessed with pleasing my subject? But by the third or fourth replay, it became clear to me that approval was not the issue. Rustin and I were in struggle. I am trying in these dreams to force him to stop and pay attention to me. The urgency and the desperation is about my perception that something is terribly wrong. All of the research I've done has grown from very immediate concerns. My projects have mixed political and personal interests that have struck close to home. I decided to write about the pre-Stonewall movement because of the experience of being an activist here in New York City in the early and mid-1970s. Those days were thrilling, but they were also bewildering. The excitement of reimagining and in the process reinventing our lives was balanced very often by a sense of being rudderless, of having not a clue as to what it was we were doing or where we were going, and of having no sense of a history or a tradition in which to anchor our activities. Rustin captured my interest because of how his life and his career seemed to speak to issues that were absorbing me at the turn of the last decade. At the end of the 1980s, something fairly remarkable and almost never commented upon was happening in the gay and lesbian movement. The executive directors, the key staff, and sometimes the board leadership of many major organizations were men and women who, if asked, would have identified themselves as being of the left. Yet there they were, running large community centers that provided social services and were dependent on government contracts. Or they were at the helm of national organizations that lobbied legislatures and worked through the courts. To paraphrase a 19th century homosexual emancipationist, they were radical souls trapped within the bodies of reformers. At a time when American civic culture left little room for an oppositional politics, here was a serendipitously creative effort by an assortment of movement types to experiment strategically. Women and men committed to a transformative social vision were engaging institutional structures in ways that seemed at quick glance as traditional as you could imagine. But if you looked more closely, you would have noticed a more complicated scenario. For instance, in the context of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, whose board I chaired during those years, it seemed that insider and outsider tactics were intentionally being played off one another. Street activists and lobbyists, the Stonewall generation and its successor, were in dialogue, and they were choreographing a new kind of social movement dance. They were mobilizing and insinuating, rabble-rousing and negotiating, dreaming boldly and plotting methodically, simultaneously. And it seemed to me that there weren't too many models around for this kind of movement activism. Instead, the history of social movements more often reflected the tension that erupted when self-defined radicals and reformers squared off against one another. Meanwhile, my teaching had been evolving so that half of what I was doing was connected to the 1960s. If any of you have worked with students on the 60s, you know how exciting the classroom can become. Undergraduates who gravitate towards these courses tend to be young men and women who are in some way at war with contemporary America. They are struggling to resist the conservative times in which we live. They are looking for any handle they can grasp to support their desire to care. They love the optimism, the passion, and the hopefulness of the 60s. They love the sense of community. They love the idea that students like themselves were making history in the 60s. It wasn't pedagogy alone, however, that was drawing me to this period of time. The trajectory of my own life was forever altered by that decade. The personal transformation set in motion by the radical politics and the culture of the 60s were the very things that later on made me receptive to the message of gay liberation. My awakening happened here at Columbia. I arrived on Morningside Heights in 1966, an overly intellectual boy from the Bronx, soaked in the patriotism of Cold War Catholicism. My first week on campus, I learned from the Protestant campus minister that God was dead. The senior who was assigned to orient me to campus life turned out to be a Dorothy Day-style Catholic who took me on retreats filled with renegade priests and nuns contemplating marriage and agonizing over the war in Vietnam. Before long, I was booing selective service representatives who visited the campus. I had eggs thrown at me by campus jocks who were angry for different reasons. In this building, I learned conversational Italian with an instructor who talked to us about student strikes in Rome and factory takeovers in Turin. Meanwhile, late at night, in what passed for the campus coffee house, I met and talked with men who wanted men. In the corridors of Butler Library across the street, I cruised the man who became my first lover. I made my first gay friends on the 6th floor of John Jay Hall, where I lived for 3 years. When students shut down the university for several weeks in 1968, I divided my time between heated political discussions in the dorms and equally heated explorations of the West Village, which I was discovering for the first time. It was great, you know, classes were canceled. You had all this extra time that you didn't ordinarily have. Of Great Awakening. The classroom, on the other hand, was experiencing a very different kind of subterranean emotional drama. No matter how I planned the course, no matter what books I used, no matter what films we looked at, somehow what emerged by the end of the semester was a story of loss and devastation. A declension narrative that took my students through the rise and then the fall of hope and optimism. The good 60s, where we began, of sit-ins, freedom rides, a war to end poverty, were always followed by the bad 60s of burning cities, Watergate, and a war in Asia. The good 60s are uplifting, while the bad 60s are wrenchingly demoralizing. Even though at the same time you could also say they're really quite thrilling. I mean, they're demoralizing, but they're also very thrilling. Okay, this is not a narrative, this rise and fall. This is not a narrative that I invented. It defines much of the historical writing on the 60s, and it's actually the story that a subset of my generation has spun out over and over and over again. Now, in my work on gay history, I've certainly proven that I can disrupt other traditional or well-established narratives. But the means to disrupt this narrative was eluding me in the classroom. And so I came upon Rustin with a set of hopes and expectations. At the time that I began researching his life, almost nothing historical had been written about him. He had a brief walk-on part as the man who organized the historic 1963 March on Washington. But there was, in one journalistic account of protest in the 60s, a chapter that focused on Rustin, and what was there intrigued me, because Rustin's life looked to be the ideal material for constructing a different narrative of the 60s, at the same time that his career resonated with the contemporary concerns of the queer movement. Rustin bridged 2 generations of radicalism in the US. To the new youth activists in the 50s and early 60s, he brought the experience of having organized during the heady years of the 1930s. His activism was suffused by deep moral conviction. He wove Quaker traditions and Gandhian principles into a seamless ethical system that shaped his dealings with Southern sheriffs, American military officers, restaurant owners in northern cities. Rustin, more than anyone, brought Gandhi to the United States. He presided over the transformation of direct action tactics from the cherished possession of a few initiatives to its embrace, really, by masses of Americans in the 60s. What was most interesting to me was the way Rustin's concerns shifted in the 60s. He had spent almost 2 decades refining direct action tactics until they perfectly comported with the moral philosophy of how human beings should be treated. Now, in the middle of the 60s, he was turning his attention to questions of strategy. How to make the tactics of protest serve a grander design of political, economic, and social revolution. At the moment when the good 60s were at this crossroads, Rustin was addressing to his comrades in the peace, civil rights, and economic justice struggles a strategic manifesto that broke dramatically with the orthodoxy of these movements. Now, it's the 60s that take me to Rustin, but it's the life of the early Rustin that captivates me. I mean, at least for this biographer, I don't think any biographer, but certainly me, could not find a more compelling early life. Rustin's story is heroic and harrowing. It abounds with triumphs and trials. It has the narrative contours of the saint and the sinner. Now, today, if you keep up on children's literature, many young boys are coming of age immersed in the fictional world of Harry Potter, the stuff of prepubescent fantasies of masculine courage and strength have become wizards and potions and magic wands and broomsticks that just fly through the air at dizzying speed. I was nurtured on the lives of the saints. As a boy, I ingested the stories of Francis of Assisi, of Ignatius Loyola, of Xavier, of Augustine. All of them were men of passion, talent, intellect. They all led oversized lives. They also perfectly embody a Catholic plot line that inverted the Puritan declension narrative. In all of their lives, it's an account really of a fall and then a rise, because in Catholic storytelling, even the grisliest deaths transmute into heroic events that are victories in a cosmic struggle. Okay. Now, a good Catholic, and believe me, I was a really good Catholic boy. A good Catholic reads these stories not with a sense of identification, but with yearning. The reader of these lives does not get to claim sainthood, but instead must pray and wish for the moment when the power of temptation yields to this almost gentle decision to follow a path of goodness. Rustin came from a very different religious tradition, but in the first 4 decades of his life, one can see played out on a grand scale a struggle. This struggle, a struggle between a desire for greatness and the troubles brought upon him by his sexual yearnings. Now, Rustin's desire for greatness was not conventional. It was not for fame or fortune or success, as American society normally measures such things. It emerged and it took shape gradually as a black adolescent of extraordinary talents came face to face with the constraints of white racism. In Rustin's life, a personal, individual decision to resist gradually evolved into something larger, to be like an Old Testament prophet leading his people to freedom. Southeastern Pennsylvania, where Rustin grew up, resembled much of Northern society in the first third of this century. It lacked the South's solidly built edifice of Jim Crow laws and customs, but it practiced segregation nonetheless. Many times, the racist practices of the North must have seemed even more infuriating because of the inconsistency of their application. In Rustin's hometown of Westchester, the elementary school, for instance, was segregated, but the high school was not. The public library was open to everyone, but the gymnasium at the YMCA and the soda fountain downtown were for whites only. Rustin, in this environment, excelled in high school. He won just about every honor that the school offered. He got prizes for essays and for oratory. His poetry was in the school magazine. He won county and state honors in football, track, and tennis. His grandmother, who was his greatest champion, reminded readers of the local press that he was the first colored youth to have won the school oratory prize in 40 years. The town's newspaper often featured on the front page his exploits. When Bayard graduated, he was a speaker at commencement, and the yearbook shows him with a longer list of awards and activities than any other senior. But while his best friend, who was white, graduated with a scholarship to an Ivy League college, Bayard closed his triumphal high school career with no college prospects. Now, despite the fame that Rustin later achieved, reconstructing the early life of an African American from a working class family in a provincial town is not easy. The Chester County Historical Society, which is where Rustin was from, the Chester County Historical Society flows over with meticulously accumulated files about white Quaker families, no offense meant, but whose doings were significant only to themselves. They don't have very much in the way of files on the Rustin clan. And yet, despite the lack of evidence, I know in the way that you recognize the change of expression on the face of someone you've lived with for 10 years, I know that sometime in high school, a decision formed and a moral resolve was made never to accept from white America the restrictions it sought to impose on his person. Rustin would go where he pleased. He would claim anyone he chose as his friend and intimate. He would have access to the intellectual traditions and the cultural resources that the world had to offer. In high school, he enacted this determination through the friendships he formed, through the refusal to leave a restaurant that denied him service, through his challenge to the authority of his athletic coach. Okay, let's jump ahead a decade now and change our locale. It's the early 1940s. Rustin is living in Harlem. He's socializing in the Village. He's attending Quaker meetings on the East Side, and he's working 3 blocks from here on Broadway. As a field secretary for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a Christian pacifist organization, he traveled from coast to coast. He lectured and organized not only in large cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, but in the small towns of the Plains, the Mountain States, and the South. Rustin was an apostle of world peace in the midst of a global war, and an apostle of racial justice before the civil rights movement commanded national headlines. Now, if there's one thing I've learned about this project, there is something about beginnings that entrances me. I don't know, the beginnings of a life before its direction is firmly set, of a career before it peaks, of social movements when they're just getting started and can't claim any successes. It's the only way to explain the fact that I devoted 7 years of my life to studying a homophile movement whose adherents barely exceeded in number the audience in this room. Well, I'm finding the same thing with the Rustin biography. I could rummage through the 1940s forever, turning up another memory, coming up with another set of the notes from one of his lectures, hunting down a clipping from another small-town newspaper where Rustin spoke. The Rustin of those years is extraordinary. The folks who knew him then, no matter what happened later in life in the relationships, recall him from the 1940s with awe. Norman Whitney, one of his Quaker mentors from this era, was reported to have said that if ever he doubted the existence of God, he always thought of Bayard. An electrifying presence, another informant told me. Such charisma that you cannot possibly imagine, someone else said. A prophetic type. There was a magic about him. Above all, in the stories that tumble from the mouths of the people that I've interviewed, comes talk about his courage. A courage called forth because of the decision never to collude with racism by acquiescing to its demands. Courage on a bus trip through Tennessee when he refuses to sit in the back, is traveling alone, is dragged off and beaten by the police. Courage as he walks down the main street of a Montana town with a white, pregnant woman. Courage when he was trapped in a house in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, surrounded by cars filled with angry white men who were armed with clubs and throwing rocks. Courage as he stood eyeball to eyeball with a screaming cold warrior on Times Square during the height of the Korean War and displayed not an impulse to defend his person. These stories circulated through the peace and Northern civil rights movement and made Rustin seem larger than life. Meeting him, one woman told me, was like being in the presence of history. Young activist wannabes encountering Rustin for the first time would imitate his speech, his gait, his gestures, as if by doing so they would be able to absorb some of his powers. And yet, at the same time, in all of these larger-than-life stories is the unmistakable sense that he always remained eminently reachable, especially to the young students whom he mentored. Rustin made a commitment to social justice seem natural, an understanding of political economy accessible, and courage as something to be found inside everyone. 20-plus years ago, when I interviewed Harry Hay and corresponded with Chuck Rowland about the founding of the Mattachine Society, I fell in love with each of them. As a young gay man trying somehow to be a gay socialist, I was touched beyond words to know that a generation earlier, gay communists in Los Angeles were plotting the liberation of a little boy in the Bronx who would one day be gay. Now, I encounter the Rustin of the 1940s, and I yearn for him. I want him in my life, but not in the life of a 50-something man who gives Kessler lectures, writes books, teaches gay studies, goes to board meetings with Urvashi. As I work on this biography, I find myself time-traveling emotionally to an earlier me. I want Rustin in the life of the fragile adolescent who came to this campus more than a generation ago and found himself confronted by unexpected challenges without any of the usual moorings. An adolescent who needed a mentor and needed believe me, very, very badly to borrow someone's courage. I want him with me at the one and only meeting of SDS that I ever attended, across the street in Fairweather Hall, and that I fled because it made me feel so stupid and inadequate. I want him with me when I sat in the middle of West 47th Street, protesting a speech by the Secretary of State and praying that the charging police horses will stop before they reach me. I want him with me as I leafleted recruits in front of the Whitehall Induction Center downtown, and an angry crowd gathers across the street, not looking friendly at all. I want him as a reassuring presence during the hair-raising, ear-splitting fights with my God and country, Cardinal Spellman-style Catholic parents over my decision to file as a conscientious objector. I want him near me as I sat quivering in front of the members of the draft board on Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, trying to persuade them to grant me CO status as they were sitting there signing the induction orders. The gays in the military debate of the 1990s has obscured a very different kind of military drama from a generation ago, when many young men were searching for ways to stay out of the military. Desperation in those days was rife, and a cottage industry of draft counseling grew up to help us. I remember one teenager whom I counseled at the center here on campus asking me, without blinking an eye, how many knuckles he needed to lose in order to be draft exempt. And I knew the answer to the question. Now, most conscientious objectors and draft resistors in those years, at least sexually speaking, were straight as an arrow. My own relationship to the draft certainly had roots in a Catholicism that was getting reconfigured each day because of my experiences on Morningside Heights. But it was also being shaped in ways that were both cliche-ridden and not by my rapidly accumulating gay experiences. Warfare was revolting to the emotional sensibilities that drove me toward men. But it was also, if I take time enough to sort of be honest about how I crafted my position as a conscientious objector, at least in my head, it was also petrifying to imagine myself in the military's domain during wartime. I couldn't tell if it was more terrifying to imagine doing what they wanted me to do, which was to kill, or doing what I knew they didn't want me to do in the military. There were also the terrors of being denied conscientious objector status in those years. The prospect of jail, the overheated melodramatic visions of prison, and for me these were not the fantasies of Jean Genet, but they were about the violence of Fortune in Men's Eyes, which was playing in New York in those years. Now, a generation earlier, Rustin had embraced terrors of a magnitude that made mine seem inconsequential. Early in 1944, he surrendered himself to federal marshals to begin serving 27 months for refusing to cooperate with the selective service system. This was in the middle of the Good War. There was no mass movement to support his resistance. As a Quaker, he could easily have qualified for alternative service as a religious pacifist, but he chose instead to have absolutely no truck with military authority. For Rustin, as a black man, to choose prison flew in the face of the logic of African American history. After emancipation, incarceration became a successor institution to slavery. If the plantation could no longer serve as a prison without walls, the prison could become a forced labor camp. State legislatures in the South revised their criminal codes to make it easier to lock black men up for petty offenses and then to be able to use them on forced labor gangs. Jails were also places in the 20th century that black men sometimes did not leave alive. They were institutions where racist brutality could be enacted with almost no constraints. And Rustin is sent to a federal prison in Kentucky, south of the Mason-Dixon line, at a time when the penal system enforced racial segregation. And he was also a gay man going to jail. Triple jeopardy barely suggests the dynamics and how the dynamics of race, sexuality, and political identity played themselves out during Rustin's incarceration. He was physically attacked by white Southern inmates for his challenge to prison segregation. He was resented by guards because of the perceived moral superiority that he projected. He was despised by just about everyone, including at times himself, for the sexual desires he could not suppress and which brought him disgrace. Rustin's time in prison was a nightmare of harrowing proportions. He spent long stretches in solitary confinement. He suffered through hunger strikes and forced feedings. He fought with guards. He faced the humiliation of confinement in a psychiatric prison facility. He felt the shame of his exposure as a deceitful homosexual before the community of pacifist militants. The photographic evidence from these years it's really quite striking. There's a picture I have of him taken just before the start of his sentence that records a really wonderful, sweet tranquility, which is totally captivating. And then I have another picture of him taken midway through these ordeals, which reveals him bitter, resentful, sullen. And yet Rustin comes out of prison not broken, but toughened, not weakened, but determined. The courage he displayed earlier now so magnified that he knows that he can face anything. And in fact, he will have to summon up this fortitude over the succeeding years. Cold War America was not a propitious time for a black Gandhian militant, publicly branded a sex pervert, to be agitating for world peace, racial justice, and a socialist vision of economic democracy. Okay, let's jump ahead again, this time to the middle of the 1960s, the moment of my awakening to a politics of radical dissent, and the historical moment that's led me to Rustin's life and the hope that it is going to illuminate for me the mysteries of how to make change. In the years between his wartime incarceration and the flowering of 60s protest, Rustin and his political comrades had lived through what, for shorthand, we can call McCarthyism. The isolation that they experienced politically as a group was compounded for Rustin by the controversies that kept erupting around his sexuality. From the late 1940s through the mid-1960s, Rustin's homosexuality seared itself into the consciousness of the peace movement and the civil rights struggle. He was jailed for it once. He was arrested a number of other times, including a few blocks from here on Amsterdam Avenue and 124th Street. He lost one job. He had his services rejected by organizations that he loved. He found himself abandoned by one mentor, A.J. Muste, and by a man whom Rustin himself had mentored, Martin Luther King. Politicians as different as Adam Clayton Powell, and Strom Thurmond deployed Rustin's sexuality in order to discredit him publicly. Right-wing organizations like the American Legion, the Minutemen, and the John Birch Society seemed at times to be trailing him around the country, making his speaking engagements flashpoints for homophobic panics. By 1964, though, Rustin's world was very different. The grim years of the Cold War and the witch hunts of the McCarthy era seemed to be in the past. Protests within the peace movement over atmospheric testing and civilian defense drills had brought the peace movement out of the shadows. Dramatic events in the South, from the sit-ins in 1960 to the Battle of Birmingham in 1963, had made racial equality the most insistent social and political issue of the times. Through the vehicle of the 1963 March on Washington, Rustin, too, was able to move out of the shadows just as these movements had, so that the success of the march made his place in this world of protest no longer seem tenuous or contingent. In the expansive freedom that his new status brought him, Rustin experiences in the mid-1960s a season of what I like to think of as strategic creativity. He was shaping ideas about politics and change that were new both to the civil rights movement and to the peace movement. These ideas grew out of his assessment of what the March on Washington and the civil rights movement meant for America. Despite the sarcasm of Malcolm X's description of the march as the farce on Washington, Rustin believed that the march had legitimized mass action. Organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League, which were always arguing against any form of public collective action, had endorsed and supported the march. The march also broadened the coalition of forces engaged in the struggle for racial equality by drawing to it white-dominated religious denominations and white-dominated labor unions. At the same time, Rustin believed that the civil rights movement was changing the whole political climate of the country. The insistent demand for freedom and justice had broken, in his view, the logjam to progressive change created by Cold War anti-communism. Rustin saw in the civil rights movement an engine that was starting to power the nation toward the kind of social and economic programs that the Johnson administration was soon to propose. Rustin's strategic perspective, which he expounded over a period of a couple of years in countless speeches, movement gatherings, and writing, revolved around a few very simple propositions. And we're going to have to bring ourselves back to 1964 and not imagine ourselves after a generation of identity-based movements. In Rustin's view, the first of these propositions was the belief that the historical moment was both propitious and transitory. For the first time since the 1930s, enough Americans were mobilized around calls for equality and justice that the possibilities for change were expansive. But moments like this, Rustin knew, were evanescent, and all around him he could see the signs of incipient backlash. The second proposition, addressed to Black America, was that success in the freedom struggle would come only through espousal of a program of change that was far more substantial than the demand for legal equality. Rustin, when he talked about this, unselfconsciously used the word revolution. His third proposition was that revolutionary change would only come to Black America through a process of securing allies and building coalitions. It could not come through the efforts of African Americans alone. Rustin also urged movement activists to push beyond their reliance on protest tactics, which, no matter how successful they might seem, kept them perpetually reproducing outsider status. Instead, he pressed them to directly engage the institutions and the structures of the American political system. And in the mid-60s, in concrete terms, Rustin urged the elements of the progressive coalition that he was calling for to see the Democratic Party as the institution that they needed to transform. Now, today, depending on the setting, Rustin's proposals, I think, can sound to us boring, they could sound controversial, they can sound naive. For contemporary progressives who regularly work with the Democratic Party, the only thing that the Democratic Party has going for it is that it is not the Republican Party. When Rustin was writing, the Democratic Party was pushing past the edge of the centrist agendas that have typified two-party politics. Rustin was saying, let's push harder. Let's make it ours. Let us be the ones to redefine its soul. For progressives today, especially those of us located in identity-based movements, the call for coalition politics has become normative. But that wasn't always so. When Rustin was arguing for what we might call a multi-issue agenda, neither the NAACP, nor Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, nor the militants in SNCC and CORE thought that minimum wage legislation, or a full employment bill, or the right of workers to bargain collectively belonged on the agenda of the civil rights movement. If multi-issue coalition politics now seems foundational to some of us, that conviction pays tribute to the power of Rustin's historical legacy, whether we know it or not. And yet, at the same time, these ideas are still controversial and are fought over every day. They are fought out in a gay movement that seems to have no trouble seeing that the military exclusion policy is a gay issue, but that can't seem to grasp, for instance, that the demonization of immigrants damages to the core the well-being of our community. In proposing this kind of a course correction, Rustin was also implicitly arguing against several distinct but also very powerfully related strands of thought in the world of American dissent. He was rejecting romanticized leftist notions of a seizure of the state, a moment of dramatic crisis when control over the levers of power shifts suddenly and decisively. He was rejecting a long tradition of American perfectionism that privileged the unbending adherence to absolute moral principle, that defined being right as more important than and at odds with being effective. He was rejecting a culture of marginality that took pride in being on the outside, one in which radical dissenters could not imagine themselves doing anything other than protesting for the rest of their days. He was rejecting also the single-issue politics that characterized much of the peace and civil rights movement from that era. Now, despite the fact that historians rewrite history all the time, the trajectory of past events doesn't shift simply because we find new ways of looking at them. But as I've investigated Rustin's life, there has been something tremendously comforting about the way he was trying to rethink radical politics in the heat of struggle. Just when these times were at the cusp of shifting from the good 60s to the bad 60s, Rustin was proposing a strategic reevaluation that promised to build rather than fracture an inchoate progressive coalition. Rustin was challenging the orthodoxy of his political world. He was opening a door to let me revisit what happened in the 1960s. He was making me, as his biographer, very happy, very satisfied, and very fulfilled. But subjects can't be counted on to cooperate so neatly with their biographer's wishes. They especially can't be counted on when those wishes are embedded in subterranean veins of emotion. I said at the beginning of this talk that the life of the biographer inevitably informs the biography that he or she writes. Well, let me take that one step further. For me, the work of biography has been most difficult where my subject's history challenges the unexamined assumptions of my own life. I have gotten stuck in the places where Rustin's life and mine are in conflict, and nowhere is this clearer than in relation to the war in Vietnam. From what I've said earlier, it must be abundantly clear that the anti-war movement served as my coming-of-age ritual. It figures as powerfully in my self-definition as my sexual coming out in those same years. In the 3 decades since I was involved in the anti-war movement, I have never once seen a need to look with detachment at that movement and reevaluate it. It has always seemed to me self-evident that the only questions to ask about it were whether we all worked tirelessly enough to end that abomination and whether more effort would have brought more results sooner. Well, scan the key public events associated with Vietnam-era protests. Scan the anti-war movement's greatest hits, and you will not see the figure of Bayard Rustin. The pacifist who chose jail as D-Day was approaching in 1944 was not on the platform in front of the United Nations in April 1967 when Martin Luther King gave an impassioned speech against the war. He was not present at the confrontation at the Pentagon in October 1967. He did not participate in the moratorium protests in 1969. He was not engaged with the turmoil unleashed by the American invasion of Cambodia. To hear some of my informants tell it, Rustin was more than absent from these events. The pain and resentment of what longtime pacifists experienced as his apostasy during the Vietnam era has transmuted over time into a belief that he actively supported the war. With the anger over his defection has come from them a search for explanations. I've been told by one person that he became the paid help of the AFL-CIO labor aristocracy. I've been told that he became a captive of the Shachtmanites, a tiny group of leftists with roots in the Trotskyist movement of the 1930s. I've been told that he was in the thrall of a young former lover, Tom Kahn. I've been told that he became a shill for the CIA. How they've come to make and believe these claims is a whole other story for another night about how the American left constructs identities and exclusions. The claims that they've made about Rustin evoke underground strands of class, race, and sexual prejudices that infected the peace movement of those decades. So for now, let me just do the very short response. It's not true that Rustin supported the war. In fact, in 1965, as opposition to the war began to crystallize, Rustin was articulating quite a vigorous pacifist response. At a major rally here in New York City in Madison Square Garden, Rustin gave a speech that one member of the audience who did not like Rustin described as by far the most inspired, principled denunciation of our foreign policy I could have expected to hear. It brought sharply into focus the connections between the struggle for civil rights and the need for an end to militarist actions abroad. During that summer and fall, Rustin is working closely with King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to craft an anti-war stance for King, whose stature made his voice particularly critical for the peace movement. But as the war escalated and as the anti-war movement mushroomed, Rustin did distance himself from it. His reservations came in a very complicated package. Some of them were framed in purely moral terms. The pacifism that he and others tried to craft in the 1940s blended Gandhi and Jesus in ways that made means and ends, words and actions inseparable. If the evil of violence was that it ruptured the wholeness of the human community, opposition to violence always had to repair the damage. Respect for the perpetrator was as important as the demand to stop the violence now. Motive and process were as critical as outcome. These were the beliefs that shaped Rustin's pacifist agitation in the 1940s, that shaped his insinuation of nonviolence into the heart of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Rustin looks at the anti-war movement after 1965 and sees it polluted by an anti-American rhetoric. He sees it morally corrupted by its endorsement of the violence of the National Liberation Front in North Vietnam. He saw a movement compromised by the unmediated rage of its leaders and participants, a movement that in his view had little in common with the pacifism that once made him choose jail. Rustin had another beef with the anti-war movement. He objected mightily to its demonization of Lyndon Johnson and to its insistence that the war, and nothing else, should determine one's stance toward the Johnson administration. Make Johnson and American liberals the enemy, Rustin warned, and support for changing the racial status quo would unravel. Support for a social and economic agenda that uprooted inequality would evaporate. Rustin was very keenly attuned to history. He knew the difference that it made that under Lyndon Johnson, for the first time since Reconstruction, the power of the federal government was wielded on behalf of African Americans. He knew how fragile and tenuous such commitments could be, and he was not willing to aid and abet a conservative backlash that was waiting for any opportunity. Of course, these are the very arguments that got Rustin into trouble. They clinched for his former comrades the belief that he had sold his soul for a mess of pottage, for invitations to White House meetings, and presidential pens from legislative signings. But though Rustin himself often framed his comments in the language of pragmatic